and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic developments in the country. In this edition, we're going to take a hard, no-holds-barred look at Finance Minister Arun Jaitley's maiden budget. Did the FM live up to those rather unrealistic expectations, or did he botch up a great opportunity? What does the fine print of the budget say the morning after? And joining me in the discussion are two of our best-known economists, Shankaracharya, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and a member of the team that ushered in the 1991 reform, and Subir Gokaran, Head of Research at Brookings India and former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Shankar, if I can start with you. You know, after the President's address, you had written that the President's address to the new Parliament sounded very much like a UPA 2 address. Would you say the same thing about the budget also? As Swaminathan Iyer has said, it sounds just like another Chidambaram budget with a little bit of saffron lipstick. Would you concur with that?
To some extent, yes, Mythili. I'm not sure I saw the saffron lipstick, but no, I mean, I think, let me put my kind of broad take on the budget. When I first heard the budget speech in a TV studio, I felt very disappointed. But when I went back and my office and read the document and some of the supporting documents, I think I found quite a lot, fair amount of positive stuff in the budget. And so I'd call it, you know, reasonably decent sort of workmanlike budget. To answer your question, yes, it could have been one done by the UPA. There's not a huge difference. There was certainly no kind of big discontinuity or breakaway or breakthrough from the budgets of the last few years. And that was clearly missing for me.
Subir, how does the budget look to you the morning after? Does it look better or does it look worse, as in most mornings after?
I'm not sure it looks any different from what it looked like yesterday. And my main reaction to it was, you know, a little bit of a letdown. In fact, I'd say a significant letdown, because I was expecting a kind of a 5-year roadmap to be laid out as a prelude, as a precursor to getting into the specific details of proposals and, you know, expenditure, taxes, other policies. But we didn't see that. So at the end of the speech, one actually, I think, had to, you know, look at the details to try and discern a strategy. And in a sense, as Shankar just said, I also had the same feeling that there are lots of little things in it which add up to something resembling a plan. And I think, you know, by now we've had this government in place for a month, over a month, 5 weeks. And this is starting to look like an approach which is no big bang, no big ticket, no sweeping statements, just looking at individual issues, problems, and trying to put solutions together. Now, whether they all hang together to solve these large problems that we're dealing with is, of course, a question. But that's the way I saw it. And I think this is where the expectations issue becomes quite significant, because the campaign raised expectations about a new broom sweeping clean, you know, a new wind and so on. And what we've got in terms of an operating style is very nitty-gritty, down to earth, pick up a problem, try and find a solution, pick up another problem, try and find a solution. It may work. I'm not, you know, questioning or not at this point skeptical that this might be a perfectly valid approach to the thing. But the communication, I think, may prove to be a little bit of letdown, because people have been conditioned to thinking that big bang is the order of the day. And clearly this budget was anything but big bang.
Shankar, what Subir found missing really in the budget was the lack of any framework for the entire 5-year period. The fact that, well, he didn't say it was quite a disappointment. He said it looked like and this is my word, slightly patchy collection of all the various schemes, and there was not a very radical change. Now, would you think that was a plus or a minus? The fact that the government didn't really have a long-term vision right now, could it be excused because they just didn't have time? It was a maiden budget. The minister had 2 heavy portfolios. So could you justify that in that sense? Or are you also disappointed by the lack of a longer term framework, particularly in the case of things like subsidy reduction?
No, I think one missed the framework dimension, and one missed the radical departure. You know, when you've had such a kind of election that we had, a few weeks ago, and a new party, new government has been voted in. Party has a parliamentary majority for the first time in many years. You expect a noticeable departure, if not a radical departure, and that I think was a bit of a disappointment. But I think if you dig a little deeper, the differences do come out from what would be, say, the standard UPA budget versus this one. For example, I'll just give a couple of examples, that, there is some sense of wanting to clamp down on subsidies. You mentioned subsidies. Nothing is as such announced in this particular budget speech by way of a administered price increase or anything like that. But, there is a very clear sentence after he announces the Expenditure Commission or the Expenditure Management Commission. The Finance Minister goes on to say that they will do an overhaul of the subsidy schemes currently existing for petroleum as well as for food. Linking up to this, just if I can flag one of my sort of serious concerns or worries about the budget in terms of content, it is about the overall fiscal stance. I mean, I think that the Minister had the opportunity, this being the maiden budget of the government, to say, look, I've inherited a fiscal mess, and he did inherit a fiscal mess to a large extent. I'm not going to go by the interim budget numbers because to me they look substantially over-optimistic. I'll give you reality, and this is where we are starting, and we'll work to bring things like fiscal and revenue deficits down over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years. But he didn't do that. Instead, he more or less adopted, in terms of broad numbers, the interim budget numbers of his predecessor, Mr. Chidambaram. And the problem with doing that, I think, on the one hand, it looks optically good to go from 4.5% last year to 4.1% in this fiscal. But I think this 4.1 is going to be not just daunting challenge, as the Minister said in Parliament himself, but I think really a bridge too far. Then you take the disinvestment target. Now, maybe because the stock markets are very buoyant, and if they remain that way, doing the 50,000 crores or whatever it is going to be feasible. But that's going to be one of the biggest sums ever mobilized. So, I mean, the budget on the receipt side rests on these numbers.
Well, I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the fine print of the budget, Mr. Jaitley's maiden budget, 2014-15. So we just heard Shankar talk about the fact that the Finance Minister failed to do a reality check. He seemed to accept the numbers given by his predecessor, even though the economy does not really show any signs of revival, and we have the possibility of a near drought-like situation. So what is your take on that? Are these numbers feasible? Should he have taken this opportunity to recast the numbers and to restore integrity to those budget numbers?
I think absolutely he should have. I don't think the stakeholder community, the broad range of stakeholders who watch the fiscal deficit numbers, with an eagle eye, would have been too concerned about moving back to about the 4.5 range, for example. And I think the minister made perhaps what is a Freudian slip in his speech. I heard him say at the end of the speech 4.5, so maybe that was somewhere in the back of his mind. But this opportunity to recast numbers, to bring element of both transparency and realism to those numbers, I think was an important one. He won't get it again because he owns the numbers from now on. Should have been taken. I agree with Shankar that the revenue estimates, it's slightly down from the interim budget, was 21% or so then, it's about 19% now. The disinvestment proceeds 65,000 crores. We're already in the fourth month of the year, so we only have 8 months left. Look very, very challenging. and I think the risk that there will be some slippage is quite high. Also, the risks, the monsoon risks were mentioned, the oil risks were mentioned. All of these kind of eventually play on the growth numbers, and if the base on which revenues are to be collected slips from an already relatively low growth expectation, that is going to add some more sort of burden to the overall fiscal position. So I think the risks are tangible. If difficult to say how high they are, because we're still waiting for the monsoon scenario to play out. But that is clearly something that will detract from the overall positivity of the budget. Yes.
Well, Shankar, I think Subir and I are both in complete agreement with you on that. This was an occasion for the finance minister to recast those numbers, and he failed to do that, and this opportunity will not come again. But having said that, apart from the minus or the fiscal arithmetic, what are the 2 or 3 big themes in the budget? Are there any big themes that you can put your finger on?
There are some nice things in there, but I don't know if I'd call them themes. I mean, on the FDI, raising the cap to 49% in both the insurance and for defense production. Remember, these are proposals, so they have to go through Parliament. I hope they will. Those are certainly welcome. The insurance one has been in the kind of waiting in the wings for many years, as you know, with different governments. But let's hope this time it goes through. I think doing the defense one is also very welcome, and I think he gave a perfectly good rationalization of why it needs to be done, since we do so much defense imports. I sensed a fairly strong commitment to the GST in terms of really trying to say, look, we've had enough debate, now let's sort of come to a head on this and hopefully an agreement and get on with it. And let's hope that they can actually deliver on this by the end of the year, have sort of legislation and constitutional amendments in place and before Parliament. That would be, I think, a very good thing. And thirdly, I think the various measures that have been announced or proposed with respect to tax administration are quite promising, both in terms of extending advance ruling to domestic enterprises or corporates, as well as trying to sort out issues of transfer pricing, which have plagued recent climate. I think there is a clear, as the minister himself said in a TV interview after the budget, sort of problem-solving approach, that he sees problems and he wants to fix them.
Subir, another item which I thought was fairly significant in the budget speech was the numerous initiatives taken in the area of infrastructure. The ministers talked about a 3P initiative institute where he's going to try and activate the PPP mechanism, which really hasn't been very successful in India. He's talked about allowing banks to do infrastructure financing by allowing them to raise deposits against which they do not have to keep SLR, CRR. He's also talked about the 5x25 structure for financing infrastructure. Though we had something similar by way of takeout financing in the past. How do you look at all these initiatives, and will they really make a difference as far as infrastructure is concerned?
I think there is an important dynamic in the infra financing area, and this comes in by linking up 2 separate strands. On the first, as you said, now banks will be relieved of the prudential requirements, SLR and CRR, if they are to finance infrastructure through the issuance of long-term bonds. I believe that's the mechanism. On the other side, so you've created in a sense an incentive to issue bonds. On the other side, the withholding tax on corporate bonds has been brought down from the old level, I think 20% to 5%, which now makes it uniform with the government securities. And what that does is to create an incentive for investors to invest in bonds. So by creating, in fact, or incentivizing both the demand and the supply of bonds here, you've actually created a mechanism for the emergence of a bond market. There are many other things that need to be done to get it up to speed. This is happening gradually, but this, I think, is an important initiative in terms of bringing into play a more feasible kind of a bond market scenario, which allows then banks to issue bonds and then to use that money to finance infrastructure. Over time, I expect this to develop into a more direct bond financing kind of environment, a kind of ecosystem, and that's a very positive change. So I think what this reflects, the couple of other things I want to get to also, is this sense of trying to address the constraints on both sides. There's no point in addressing the constraints on one side if the other side remains binding. So I think this is a good example of that sort of problem-solving approach that we've been hinting at. The other issue I want to emphasize is agriculture, where a number of initiatives, all of which add up to, I think, the need to diversify into crops other than cereals, and a specific reference to proteins. I'm very pleased with that. That's been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. But in a sense, creating incentives for production of other things, including, of course, a very ambitious, what appears to be a very ambitious national level reform of the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act, the APMC. Now, that's a state level issue, so I'm not sure how it plays out. But bottom line is, I think the combination of agricultural initiatives do offer some solution to the kind of inflation, the food inflation problem that we've really not been able to get to grips with over the last several years. So when we look at this approach, while it looks very pragmatic, and I agree, I accept that it is a pragmatic approach, the risks associated with implementation grow because you have to bring many more stakeholders, many more constituencies into play to get things to work. So that's where I'm sounding a little bit of a cautionary note on this approach.
So he's brought a problem-solving approach to the entire issues, both in infrastructure as well as agriculture. But on that note, we slip into another very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're trying to pass the fine print of the budget 2014-15. Shankar, you were part of the team which in 1991 was that path-breaking budget speech of Dr. Manmohan Singh. Is the budget, there were a number of, reforms that were announced in that budget speech. Is the budget speech the right place to announce those kind of second-generation reforms? And were they missing? Why were they missing? Were you disappointed? What do you think should have been the approach of the government?
First, Mythili, I have to correct you. On the 91 budget speech, I wasn't actually physically there. I hadn't yet come back as Chief Economic Advisor, but that's a small point. I joined them a year or two later. But I can still make the comparison, I think, which is that I think in that sense, whereas the 91 budget speech really was trying to change the paradigm for economic management, getting away from control regime and so on and so forth, in many dimensions. I don't think, as I said, I don't think that this budget speech has any of that paradigm change. Now, the big problem area, the so-called second generation reforms that you mentioned, include, as you know, things like, the whole, how to liberalize what economists call factor markets, in particular labor law reforms, reforms of land markets, which of course has got complicated by the recently passed Land Acquisition Act, which most people who comment on it regard as very onerous and probably not only raises the price of land several-fold for any buyer, whether for infrastructure or for industry, but also is a very cumbersome and time-consuming thing. So, those people, and there were many, I think, including sometimes myself, who expected some announcements on those about future legislation to amend these laws, were disappointed. And in that sense, no big-ticket reforms did not get announced. And one other thing I would say, while I have the chance, that I, remember the discussion of capital for the PSU banks, which was in the budget speech this time. Now, while the finance minister mentioned this and also gave some numbers, he did not actually make any allocation in the budget because his view was that public sector banks should go to the market to raise these funds. However, he put the caveat that majority ownership by government has to continue. Now, that is quite striking, that This is quite different from the previous NDA government, where, if you recall, Mr. Yashwant Sinha as finance minister had, tabled legislation to amend the Banking Regulation Act to bring the 51% down to 33%. Of course, it didn't pass. That's a different matter. But there's no talk of that. So I think when it comes to the issue of privatization of, or what looks like privatization of banks, and perhaps even more broadly other enterprises, I'm not sure that this government is on the same page as the predecessor NDA government.
Okay, so not on the same page as the predecessor NDA government. How do you react to that, Subir? Were you surprised by the absence of any mention of second generation reforms, or do you think this was neither the time nor the place?
No, it was very much the time, which is what I think was the basic source of my less than enthusiastic response to the budget, in at least in the communication sense, not, as I said, in necessarily in the detailed sense. I thought, this is a first-year government. This is the first budget of a new government. After 10 years, we've had a change. Lots of problems with the economy. You can attribute them to various causes, but I think we do need to have a diagnostic, which, in a sense, the economic survey did provide reasonably sort of balanced diagnostic. And based on that diagnostic, what are the solutions that the new government offers? So the survey and the budget, I think, in this context had to, dovetail with each other. May not agree with everything that the survey says, may not accept everything as being feasible, but to the extent that they've identified a number of factors, and there were some of them in the capital markets and so on. I'm not denying that there were some linkage, but the strategy that emerges from that diagnostic, I think, needed to be articulated in the first budget. And my judgment is that it wasn't. So we had to actually glean the strategy from the various initiatives. I think that's a communication challenge. So somewhere soon, I think the government must use an appropriate opportunity, maybe the August 15th, but that's really a mass audience kind of speech, so it may not be easy to break it down into very explicit strategies. But something like that needs to lay out a sort of a sense of direction on all of these fronts: infrastructure, agriculture, employment, capital markets, land acquisition, education, health. I mean, everything requires some clear goalposts, and I don't think we've seen that. Perhaps the budget could have started the process. I don't think it did adequately, but now we have to wait for another occasion when these goalposts start to get articulated, and I hope that's done fairly soon, because otherwise there is a danger that the government is not seen to be acting in sync, acting in coordination, and that is a very strong message that came out of the campaign, that this government believes in this kind of intense coordination. We even had talk about ministries being merged and things, which we have not seen any signs of so far.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition of Macros with Mythili, where we've been discussing the fine print of the budget. And as you, Shankar, mentioned, the problems that this government inherited, the economic legacy, the problems run so deep that there are no quick fixes. But on that note, I'm afraid we have to wrap up the show. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Subir, also for joining us in this discussion. But please do remember, we'll be back next week, same time, with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.